大家下午好，欢迎来到今天的 Global 系列的讲座。我是今天的主持人。我们非常荣幸地邀请到宁波诺丁汉大学国际事务与国际关系系助理教授 Matteo 先生为大家主讲麦哲伦航海和全球化的起源。Good afternoon, everyone. I'm your host. Welcome to the Global series of Tianyi Lecture. It's our great honor that Mr. Matteo from the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China, is with us to share about Magellan's voyage and the origins of a globalized world. Now, let's enjoy his fascinating lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your invitation and for the kind introduction. Today, I would like to talk with you about a very interesting topic that is Magellan's voyage and how this voyage can tell us something about the history of early globalization. I will start with an introduction to the context, to the historical context of this voyage, and then I will briefly summarize the story of the voyage, and finally I will give you some reflections on the achievements and the significance of this feat. Ferdinand Magellan is not as famous as Christopher Columbus. Even among academics, there are not as many books about Magellan as you can find about Columbus. But I think that his story, the story of this journey of exploration, deserves to be remembered for at least 3 reasons. First of all, this year, 2022, is the 500th anniversary of this voyage. As you can see from this first slide, the voyage sailed from Seville in 1519, and the few survivors returned to Seville in Spain in 1522, so exactly 500 years ago. Secondly, this voyage was the first circumnavigation of the world. So for the first time in recorded history, a group of people traveled all around the planet. And finally, this voyage is also important if we want to reflect on the complex origins of the globalized world in which we live. I will not have a lot of time to reflect on that today, but it's surely another reason why it is worth talking briefly about this voyage with you. Now, I know that most of the audience is probably not an expert in this field. Many of you will not be professional historians. So I want to dedicate some time, the first part of this talk, to the historical context, the societies, the world in which Magellan and Columbus, as well as Queen Isabella, who I will introduce later, were born and lived. And the context here is Iberia, the Iberian Peninsula. Now, the Iberian Peninsula, at the end of the Middle Ages, in the 15th century, was surely not an impressive place. Apparently, the Kingdom of Portugal and the Kingdom of Castile were not the kind of places on which you would have bet if we were to guess which kingdoms would have led an age of exploration and the first wave of global empire building and global trade in the history of the planet. Europe was, economically speaking, at the periphery of Eurasia, and within Europe, Portugal and Castile were themselves among the poorest and weakest countries. We all know the nation of Portugal today. We still use this name. For Castile, well, this is a word that I will use throughout this talk. Castile was one of the kingdoms that later will merge to form what today we call Spain. So I will use the word Castile and Spain a bit interchangeably today. In the 15th century, Portugal was a poor country with a quite primitive economy. It only had about 1 million people living there. Portugal didn't have an even distribution of fertile lands, so very often it didn't have enough grain to feed its population. Portugal was also lacking a well-developed maritime tradition, and for long stretches of the 15th century, it wasn't even able to mint any coin because it was lacking gold and silver. In fact, the little amount of gold that was trickling into Portugal was coming mostly from Morocco, which means that the gold had to cross the Sahara Desert. This flow of gold was unreliable and quite expensive for the Portuguese. Portugal was also poor in timber, in wood that was needed to build ships, among other things. Portugal often had to fight for its own survival in the sense of its independence, of its continued independence, with its neighbor, the Crown of Castile. Castile was also not very impressive, apparently. It was a country often torn by civil wars and dynastic crises. And Castile, contrary to Portugal, had not yet completed the process of reconquista, as it's called in Spanish, so the reconquest of the Iberian territories from the Muslim invaders that had come in the 8th century. And as you can see from this map, in fact, on the south of Castile, there was still the last of these Islamic strongholds, Granada. However, notwithstanding all these weaknesses, Portugal and Castile did lead the age of European explorations. They started to map an area of the Atlantic Ocean that led them to the rediscovery of the Canary Islands. And the Canaries are very important because this group of islands will be the springboard for what historians sometimes call the two wings of Atlantic exploration. So let's talk briefly about these two wings of exploration, because they were characterized by different aims, different objectives, different strategies. The south wing of exploration from the Canary Island followed the coast of Africa and tried to map the coast of Africa with ships working their way south. One of the main objectives here for Portugal was reaching the origin of gold-producing, was to reach gold-producing regions, so the origin of the gold trade across the Sahara Desert. Or anyway, the objective was to reach some areas closer to the points of origin, so that the flow of gold could be more regular and cheaper from the perspective of the Portuguese. As the Portuguese started to trade regularly with West African kingdoms and empires, such as Mali, Benin, and with African merchants, they didn't only acquire gold, but also slaves and malagueta pepper, which is a special kind of pepper produced in West Africa. Now, if we think of the west wing of exploration, still starting off from the Canary Islands, now you can quite easily reach the Canary Islands by sail if you leave from Portugal. But when you want to come back, you meet one of the first tricky problems of Atlantic navigation. Due to some currents and winds, it is very difficult to return by a straight path, by a straight route from the Canary Islands back to Iberia. And so Portuguese and Spanish sailors and Italian sailors started to make a sort of small volta, meaning they started to navigate a bit west towards the center of the ocean, to then pick up some easterly winds that will push them back towards the coasts of Iberia when they were coming back, when they were returning from the Canary Islands. Now, if you do this for a number of times, and if you become more familiar with these currents and with this water, sooner or later you will hit Madeira. You will discover the islands of Madeira. And so it happened that the Portuguese discovered Madeira and the Azores, two other groups of islands. And there, the Portuguese established colonies. These islands, Madeira and the Azores, were initially uninhabited. They were not inhabited by anybody. So the Portuguese started initially to produce grain. Remember, earlier I told you that Portugal was suffering from a lack of grain and foodstuff. But later, in Madeira and in the Azores, also with the help of some Italian entrepreneurs, the Portuguese established industries producing wine and sugar. Why did they need the help of Italians, and in particular Italians from the city of Genoa? It's because to produce sugar, to start some sugar plantations and sugar mills, you need capital, which the Portuguese also lacked, and you need know-how, some experience in running this kind of business. And so within the Portuguese colonies in Madeira and the Azores, there were Italian colonies in particular. This is important because, for example, Christopher Columbus, before sailing under the flag of the Castilian monarchy, had lived in Portugal for many years. And he had worked in this business linking Madeira to Lisbon, linking Madeira to Portugal. Now, as Portuguese and Castilian ships map larger and larger stretches of water and coast in the Atlantic, they are in a rivalry. Obviously, they are rivals in these enterprises. And there is already a history of warfare and rivalry between the Kingdom of Portugal and the Kingdom of Castile, between Portuguese and Spanish. So I will not burden you with too many names of kings or with too many names of battles and treaties, but you should know that at some point between 1479 and 1494, Portugal and Castile reach an agreement. The agreement is that the Canary Islands will belong to Castile. But in exchange for that, the Portuguese, from now on, will have a monopoly on the south wing of Atlantic exploration. Only Portuguese ships will be allowed to trade along the African coast. Only Portuguese ships will be allowed to explore the southern shores of Africa. This is important. This is important because of this rivalry, Portugal and Spain, in a sense, fight each other, but also cooperate with each other because the claims of one of them rest upon the claims of the other. So Portugal maps, indeed, all of the coast of Africa and eventually reaches the Cape of Good Hope. And from there, Portuguese ships enter the Indian Ocean and they push further east, thereby initiating a profitable trade in Eastern spices. This trade is, as I said, very profitable. And so Portugal has obtained a very important success. Now it's turning from a primitive economy, from an impoverished economy, into the main importer of precious goods from Asia into Europe. On the other hand, Castile seems to be in trouble because Castile has accepted that Portugal will have a monopoly on this southern wing of exploration. And in fact, Portugal and Castile have drawn a line, a meridian line across the Atlantic Ocean from north to south, dividing the world into two spheres of exploration. Portugal will have a monopoly in exploring all of the lands and seas to the east of that line, while Castile will have a monopoly in exploring all the lands and seas to the west of the line. So what could Castile do to react to this success of Portugal? This is the context for Christopher Columbus' arrival at the Spanish court, at the Castilian court. So Columbus is not really the subject of my talk today, but I think that it is interesting to view Christopher Columbus' voyages from this perspective, right? From the perspective of this rivalry and of this race to Asia between Portugal and Spain. Columbus has an idea. The idea is that you can reach Asia by sailing west. So it is possible to counteract, to respond to Portuguese success by establishing a trading route that goes across the Atlantic Ocean. He proposes his idea. The king and queen of Castile listen to him. They set up a committee of experts. And this committee of experts come back and says, well, Columbus' idea is pretty crazy because Columbus has greatly underestimated the distance between Europe and Asia. He has greatly underestimated the size of the globe for what people could guess at the time. And so they think that this voyage is impossible. His idea is initially rejected. But Queen Isabella, who shares a lot of Columbus' value system, a lot of Columbus ideas, a lot of Columbus expectations about the future, both of them, both Isabella and Columbus, have a profound Christian faith, and they believe that the end of the world is near. Well, she decides to suddenly send a messenger to fetch Columbus, to call him back, to tell him, okay, whatever, it doesn't matter what the expert told us, we are going to sponsor your voyage. And so Columbus' voyage of 1492, which is also the year in which the Reconquista is over. So you see, immediately after completing the Reconquista, the Castilians try to catch up in this race with the Portuguese, in this race to the east. Well, Columbus' first voyage takes place in 1492, and it should be seen, or it can be seen, that's what I'm proposing today, it can be seen from this perspective. Again, it could be seen from many other perspectives. And from this perspective, Columbus' voyage is a failure because he doesn't find a way to China and Japan and to the wealthy markets of Asia as he had promised. Instead, he finds what will eventually be revealed as the American Wall. This huge continent, there is a new continent, quote unquote, new continent for the Europeans. And this new continent is enormous. And again, if you look at it from the perspective that I've given you today, it is a sort of obstacle. It's a sort of wall separating Castile from its true objective, which was trade with Asia. In the following decades, voices of the success of Portugal in its trade with the East continue to reach the ears of people at the Castilian court. For example, here you have a nice quotation from Giovanni da Empoli, who was actually an Italian merchant who visited Asia on Portuguese ships. And you can see what he said about that experience. He loves the markets of the East. He praises the industries that he finds in Asia. And he's excited about trading spices, silk, and other goods in these markets. In other words, people in Spain, people in Castile are aware that Portugal is getting rich. Portugal is getting rich by importing large amounts of spices to Lisbon. But there's also another issue. It's not only an economic issue. It's also a geopolitical issue that worries people in Castile. By the way, in this quote, you can see that Giovanni da Empoli is basically saying that India is the minor and poorest thing that there is here, meaning we thought that already when we reached India, already when we reached the Malabar coast, which is the southwestern coast of India, we thought that, wow, these markets are amazing here, we can buy so many things and bring them back to Europe. Now he's gone beyond India, he's gone into Malacca, Malaysia, and he finds even larger markets, even wealthier economies. Again, it's not only this problem that the Castilians have to face, the economic problem. There's also a geopolitical problem. And the geopolitical problem is well represented by this quotation from Maximilian Transilvanus. Now, Maximilian was a courtesan. He was an intellectual living at the Spanish court. And he talks about a rumor here. He tells you that some people in Castile, in Spain, are starting to think, wait a minute, the Portuguese are so successful in their establishment of trade routes and colonies in Asia, that they are pushing so far east that they may invade our sphere of exploration. Because remember, a few minutes ago, I told you that Portugal and Castile have drawn this line across the Atlantic Ocean. Obviously, when they drew that line, they did not see this nice, perfect map that we can see here. They had no idea that something like Australia even existed, or they had no idea of the full shape of the American continent. They didn't know anything about that. And they are not really sure. If you keep drawing that line that cuts across the Atlantic through the poles and on the other side of the globe, where is that line going to fall? That is really unclear at the moment. And so some people in Castile are starting to worry. Well, maybe the Portuguese are so successful, they're going so far east that they will eventually invade our sphere. This rivalry soon focuses on a group of islands that produce cloves in great abundance, so a special kind of spice in great abundance. And those are called the Spice Islands, which are the islands that today usually we call the Moluccas. So the race to the east, the race to Asia, turns into a more specific race, the race to the Moluccas, the race to the Spice Islands. Nobody really knows if the Spice Islands fall east or west of that line of demarcation once you keep drawing it on the other side of the globe. Nobody really knows about that. So this is the context. This is the context for Magellan's voyage. I've introduced you to this history of unlikely success of Portugal and partly of unlikely success of Castile as well, but Castile clearly is in trouble in this race. This is the context that you need to appreciate in order to approach the story of Magellan's voyage, and this is what I turn to now. Who is Magellan? Paradoxically, Ferdinand Magellan is a Portuguese man. This may seem strange initially. Why is a Portuguese man helping to solve Castile's problem? Well, Ferdinand Magellan has a very impressive CV when he introduces himself to the court of the Spanish king. Or rather, he is introduced at the court of the Spanish king. He is a Portuguese captain with 8 years of experience in Asia. He has traveled on Portuguese ships. He knows very well the Asian markets. He has contacts among the very few Portuguese who have ever set their feet on the Moluccas, on the Spice Islands. However, Ferdinand Magellan is disappointed. He is disappointed because he believes that he is being mistreated by his king. He thinks that he should have been rewarded more handsomely. He believes that he should be rewarded more handsomely for his services to the Portuguese crown in Asia. And at some point, he decides that his king is not rewarding him well enough, And so he will move to Castile and offer his experience, his services to the Spanish crown. That is exactly what he does. And how can Ferdinand Magellan help the Spanish crown? Well, Magellan believes that he has a plan that can work. It is a plan that, to some extent, corresponds to Christopher Columbus' vision. The vision of reaching Asia by sailing west. Now, several decades have passed since Columbus' voyages. Many Spanish expeditions have mapped an important section of the American coastline. And many Spanish expeditions have failed to find a passage through the American wall. Still, a majority of people, including Magellan, are convinced that there must be a passage, there must be a way, there must be a strait through which ships can sail from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, to the next sea, and reach Asia. But where can this strait be? Magellan is convinced that he knows where it is, and that he can find it, he can lead a Spanish expedition through it, and he can lead a Spanish expedition to the Spice Islands. This is what he promises to the king, and this is the mission that he is given. So in 1519, Magellan and his crew leave from Seville in Spain, sail from Seville. And the voyage, the story of the voyage is very interesting. It is a time terrible. It is quite violent. It's a time entertaining. I don't have the time now to tell you all of the details, but I will split the voyage into 3 phases. The first phase of the voyage is the crossing of the Atlantic Ocean and the search for the strait. Now, this first phase in the voyage is characterized by the rivalry, actually, I will call it the hatred between Portuguese and Spanish officers. Let us remember once again, Magellan is a Portuguese leading a Spanish expedition. He has chosen several officers among Portuguese. But there are also Spanish officers on board and many other Spanish members of the expedition. Now, these Spanish officers, these Castilian officers, don't want to take orders from a foreigner. They don't trust Magellan, they don't like Magellan, and they try to undermine his authority at every turn. On the other hand, Magellan is a very tough guy. He's not the kind of person who will have his authority undermined. When he starts taking decisions without consulting his Spanish officers, these organize a mutiny. During the winter, when they are wintering along the coast of South America, Spanish officers take control of most of the ships. But Magellan, with a mix of tricks and violence, ruthlessly puts down the mutiny, executes several of these traitors, and he maroons his main enemy among the Spaniards on the coast of Patagonia. He leaves him on the coast of Patagonia with no supplies and therefore destined to die in the middle of nowhere. So it is not a happy group of people, the group of people who approach the southern end of the American continent in October 1520. These had just happened. The mutiny, the response from Magellan had just happened. Yet, in the middle of a storm, Magellan is able to find the strait that bears his name. He knew that other explorers had already tried to find the strait in the southern portion of the American continent, and they have failed. So he goes beyond the Rio de la Plata, further south. That's why he winters in Patagonia, and then between October and November 1520, the strait is found. And Magellan leads the ships through the maze of water, ice, land, that is the strait, and through the other side. This marks perhaps we could say the end of the first phase of the voyage. Look at what had been accomplished. Magellan has succeeded, one may say, where Columbus had failed, although obviously once you look at the geography of the American continent that we have in mind today very easily, you can see why Columbus could not have possibly succeeded. But he succeeded also where many other explorers had failed. He found the passage on to the next sea. Now, the question is, what does the next sea look like? Magellan and his men have no idea of where exactly they are when they start crossing the Pacific Ocean. They have no idea of how long it's going to take. They have no idea that the Pacific Ocean is the largest stretch of water on the planet. Think about it. They don't have enough food. They don't have enough water. Many of the men are afflicted by scurvy. And here is a witness to this voyage across the Pacific, which is in a sense the second phase of the entire enterprise, from the discovery of the strait to what happens in the Philippines. I will get to that in a moment. Antonio Pigafetta is neither Portuguese nor Castilian or Spanish. He's actually an Italian knight. He's a very curious character. He found himself in Spain at the time in which the expedition was being organized. He heard about this expedition and he used some recommendations to have the permission to join it, because he really wanted to have an adventure, to become famous due to this adventure. And thankfully, he is one of the very few survivors. Once back, he wrote an account, the first voyage around the world, an account of the expedition. And here is what he has to say about the crossing of the Pacific. That takes more than 3 months and was a terrible, horrifying experience with people starving and even trying to eat rats on the ships. He concludes his thoughts by saying, "In truth, I believe no such voyage will ever be made again." And I have here a picture of an exact replica of one of the ships of the expedition. So I want you to have a look at it for a moment. Look at how this wooden ship was one of the best vessels that Europe could produce at the time, but really rudimentary, quite rudimentary if you think about it. Imagine being in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, surrounded by huge waves, while you are on this piece of wood. That's the experience that Pigafetta and the others go through. And yet Magellan is able to lead them somehow across the vast ocean. Historians have discussed quite a lot why did Magellan take this northerly route across the Pacific, and why once he reached the Philippines, he wasted time there. Why didn't he directly go to the Moluccas, to the Spice Islands? Isn't that the objective of the mission? Well, yes, but I don't think that this is a mystery, and I don't think that Magellan was wasting his time. If you realize that the document he signed with the king, the contract he signed, says that Magellan can choose one island for himself to build a warehouse, a factory there, and establish sort of personal trade, international trade there, if he discovers more than 6. The first 6 will go to the crown. So when you realize that, you understand that Magellan wasn't wasting his time in the Philippines. He was trying to discover more than 6 islands and establish some friendship, some personal connection with some of the local kings in the Philippines. Well, he does establish friendship with the king of Cebu. But then he has the idea of trying to show off the military skills of the Iberians, how Iberians can fight well. And so in a battle against another king, another local king who was an enemy of his new friend, Magellan is wounded and captured and dies shortly thereafter. Magellan dies in the Philippines, therefore. And from now, the third and final phase of the voyage begins, which looks quite aimless. The few survivors wander around the islands, not really sure of what to do. They eventually sail south to Brunei, and then on to the Spice Islands. They arrive in Tidore, one of the Spice Islands, one of the Moluccas. Only 2 ships are left. In fact, there were 3, but so few men are left alive that they cannot even man effectively 3 ships, so they decide to burn to destroy the 3rd one. And these 2 ships now have to go back home. Now, one of the ships attempts to follow what had been originally the plan, going back by the same route. So one ship tries to sail back across the Pacific Ocean, finding again the strait, and returning by way of the Atlantic. But this ship fails to do that, because of course, it had already been a sort of miracle that the ships had been able, led by Magellan, to cross a new uncharted ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the first time around. Now they're trying to go back, and they don't know the winds and currents that will take many decades to the Spanish to work out. So this ship cannot make the second crossing, the return crossing of the Pacific. It goes back to the Spice Islands, heavily damaged. The crew is discovered by some Portuguese there. The Portuguese arrest the Spanish and put them to forced labor. So most of this group will never see Spain again. But there is a second ship, the only ship that makes it back to Seville. Goes back to Seville by crossing the Indian Ocean, but notice the incredibly southerly route followed across the Indian Ocean, because they were trying not to be intercepted by any Portuguese force. Then they enter the Atlantic and go up north all the way to Seville, returning to Seville in September 1522. At this point, the leader of the expedition, after the death of Magellan, is a Spanish man called Juan Sebastián Elcano, which is the reason why sometimes when you look for information about this voyage, you will find that it's called the Magellan-Elcano expedition. The first circumnavigation of the world had been completed. Most of the men, most of the ships were lost, but the voyage was completed. Now, I want to briefly reflect on the achievements and the significance of this voyage. There will be so much to say. We don't have really a lot of time. But I think that we can try to start from some of the voices of people living through these events at the time. So here you have Maximilian Transylvanus. He did not take part in the voyage, but we have already met him earlier, remember? He's a courtesan. He lives at the Spanish court, so he is quite well informed. He writes, the Castilians in their voyages westwards and the Portuguese sailing eastwards have sought out, discovered, and surveyed so many places, even beyond the Tropic of Capricorn. And now these countrymen of ours have sailed completely around the world. So I guess that what we can say about this quotation is that surely there is the awareness of the historic achievement. For the first time, somebody has sailed around the world. The second quotation comes from Juan Sebastian Elcano, whom I've just told you was part of the expedition, in fact, took over the leadership in the last stretch of the voyage for the only ship that made it back. He's writing to the King of Spain. He says, furthermore, Your Majesty will know that what we should especially appreciate and value is that we have discovered and encompassed the whole circle of the world. Since going west, we return from the east. Again, there is that awareness of what has been accomplished. But there is also a bit of pride here that you can see, because he is one of the people who did it. Finally, there is Antonio Pigafetta, whom we also have already encountered, the Italian knight who survived the voyage and who left us a full account of it, a very colorful account of it. And Pigafetta says, in a very straightforward manner, he says, when we left that strait, the Strait of Magellan, if we had sailed continuously westward, we will have circumnavigated the world without finding other land than the Cape. This is the understanding embodied in this quotation, that all the oceans are one. This is one of the great achievements of Iberian explorations. The mapping of key straits and capes and coastlines that eventually confirm that all the oceans of the world are one, because all the oceans are connected and they can be navigated without interruption by a ship. Before concluding, I want to show you a couple of maps that I really love. This globe is a beautiful, colorful globe full of details and names that was put together in the 1450s in Venice. Now, this globe was, on the one hand, quite traditional in the sense that it shows the division of the world into three main continents, Europe, Africa, and Asia, as it was understood at the time. But it is also quite innovative, because Fra Mauro introduces, well, he's not the first one to introduce this hypothesis, but he adopts the hypothesis that around Africa, there is a narrow strip of sea, do you see that on the map, that can be navigated. He even draws a little ship down there. Maybe you cannot see it. Now, in the 1450s, Portugal had not yet mapped all of the coast of Africa. Nobody really knew if Africa could be rounded. In other words, many Europeans thought that the Indian Ocean was a landlocked sea. It could not be reached by sailing across Africa. Here, Fra Mauro introduces, or anyway, he sides with an alternative view. There is the view that, no, you can actually, no, the Indian Ocean is not landlocked. You can indeed navigate around Africa. There is a debate. In medieval Europe, there is a debate about the shape of the continents, the shape of the seas, the shapes of the earth. And I don't have the time now to get into Ptolemy and the recovery of Ptolemy in the 15th century, why that is important, but why also that is important because it sparks debates. Debates that are possible in Europe also thanks to a tradition in medieval Europe, a tradition of intellectual debates that are institutionalized in the universities, right? One of the great inventions of the Middle Ages is the university system. However, if you look at this globe, there is something that tells you a lot about the perception of the cosmos, the perception of the universe, the perception of man's role in the universe. Around all the known continents, there is an impassable darkness. There is a narrow stretch of water that cannot be navigated. Or rather, a narrow stretch of water that cannot be passed. You could theoretically navigate around it, but you cannot go beyond it. So you cannot navigate around the globe. Fra Mauro introduces a series of dark islands and dark waters at the outskirts of his map. So the idea of human mobility is very limited. Human mobility is limited, and the movement of people can only take place in a limited set of areas of the world. Now, if you look at the second map that I'm about to show you, you can see the change. This is Diogo Ribeiro's map from 1529. Now, I know that probably many of you are thinking, oh, okay, there's a great change, right? There's a great change because the figures of continents that we see here, also the distances between them, start looking familiar to us. This is a familiar representation of the world. But what I want you to reflect on is not so much the fact that the shape of the continents is now more accurate, that the spaces between continents start to look a bit more precise. Rather, what I would like you to think of is the disappearance of the impassable darkness. And the realization in this map that all the oceans of the world are one. They can be navigated. The globe can be circumnavigated. Look, notice how even in the middle of the deepest ocean, Ribeiro has drawn ships, vessels, human activities, people moving around. And so, the conception of human mobility has been revolutionized. One of the events that changed the perception of human mobility between the first map and this second map was Magellan's voyage around the world. And before concluding, I would like to go back for a moment to the Atlantic. The Atlantic is the core of early globalization. Why? Because Atlantic waters had been for so long an obstacle to long-distance movement, to the connection, to stable connections between continents, due to the very complex system of winds and currents characterizing the Atlantic Ocean that you can partly see here in this representation. That's why for the Portuguese, it was so difficult to go around West Africa, to navigate along Central Africa. So difficult because the currents don't help. There's a maze of currents there. Now, during the age of European explorations, what had been the greatest obstacle for human interaction and stable interaction, that's what I mean, becomes instead the springboard of early globalization. That's why the Atlantic is so important. And so from this perspective, Magellan's discovery of the strait is not important because in and of itself changes completely navigational patterns. In fact, that route through the strait was not very convenient. It has never been used a lot for shipping. But rather, Magellan's discovery of the strait is the symbol of the conclusion of a process of mapping and understanding of Atlantic spaces, winds, currents. And so we can say that Magellan's voyage also embodies the beginning of a process of globalization. Now global markets are truly possible. And one of the first global markets, just to give you an example, will be, in the 16th century, the global silver market, which of course involved China. China had a great demand for silver during the 16th century. And China was able, indeed, to monetize its economy and to grow its economy, also thanks to the enormous quantities of silver that Iberian merchants brought to China, mostly from American mines. So we see that, right, this is the beginning of a process of global markets that link together all the continents of the world. There will be much more to say about this, but due to the limited amount of time, I think that I will end here. And, before leaving you, I just want to tell you that I have mentioned at least a couple of times Antonio Pigafetta, the Italian knight who travels with Magellan and who is one of the few survivors of the voyage. Now, the account that Antonio Pigafetta writes is one of the most beautiful documents from the 16th century. The way in which he describes Asian societies is colorful, is touching, very sympathetic. And if you are interested in knowing more about Antonio Pigafetta, about his account, about his witness to this voyage, I suggest you to visit this link where you can download for free the entire book, Travel Writings on Asia, which I have recently co-edited with my colleague, Christian Müller, who also teaches at UNNC. And in this book, you will find one chapter that I wrote that discusses specifically Pigafetta and gives you some examples of his ways of telling about Asian societies to his fellow Europeans once he came back. He disseminates images of Asia across Europe with his book that will be very influential in the future. So I leave you with this link, and thank you very much for your attention. I hope this was interesting.
感谢 Matteo 先生的精彩讲授，也谢谢大家的线上收看。希望可以继续关注 Glocal 系列的讲座，我们下期再见。Thanks for Mr. Matteo's interesting lecture, and thank you all for watching through it online. Stay tuned for our Glocal series, and I will see you next time. Thank you.